middle-aged rancher alone for 8 years, until an Apache woman came begging at his door in the rain. John Whitman lived alone on his ranch in the wide-open plains of New Mexico. His land stretched for miles, dotted with sagebrush, rocks, and the occasional gnarled tree. He had spent most of his life here, raising cattle, mending fences, and tending to the fields. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and he had taken it over after his father passed away. Yet, despite the vast land and endless sky, John felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on him every single day. It had been 8 years since his wife Mary had passed away. She had been the heart of the ranch, the one who brought warmth and laughter to the otherwise quiet place. Since her death, the house felt colder, the rooms emptier. The kitchen table had a permanent imprint of where she used to sit, and her favorite chair by the window remained untouched. John had tried to keep busy, but no amount of work could fill the silence that echoed through the house at night. John's mornings followed a strict routine. He would rise before dawn, the cold morning air cutting through his thin pajamas as he stepped outside. The smell of wet earth and the faint scent of horses greeted him. He would feed the cattle, repair fences that had been damaged overnight, and check the water troughs. Each day was a repetition of the last, a rhythm that gave him purpose, but also reminded him of his solitude. He missed the sound of Mary's voice, the laughter of friends and neighbors who no longer visited, and the simple joy of sharing a meal with someone who understood him. Despite the routine, John was careful not to let his loneliness show. He kept to himself and rarely ventured into town unless it was absolutely necessary. The people in the nearby town knew him as quiet, reliable, and hard-working, but they did not know the depth of the ache in his heart. He had friends once, neighbors who would stop by for a cup of coffee or a chat, but over the years those connections had faded. Life had moved on without him, leaving him anchored to his land and memories. Evenings were the hardest. John would sit in the living room with a cup of coffee, staring into the fire that Mary had loved to keep burning. He sometimes picked up her letters, written years ago, and read them again. He never sent them. They were meant to be private, a way to feel close to her once more. His dog, a loyal border collie named Dusty, would curl up at his feet, sensing his sadness and offering silent companionship. Dusty was the closest thing to family John had left, and he often spoke to the dog as if he were Mary herself, telling him about the day, his thoughts, and sometimes his regrets. The ranch itself was a reflection of John's life, tough, resilient, and weathered by time. The fences were sturdy but needed constant repair. The barns, though functional, creaked under the weight of years and storms. John found comfort in the work. It kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Yet even as he mended fences or guided the cattle, there was a constant reminder that he was alone. Sometimes when he looked across the fields at sunset, he imagined Mary walking beside him, her laughter carried by the wind.
He shook his head, trying to chase the memory away, but it lingered, bittersweet and haunting.
John was not a man who easily showed emotion. He had learned to keep his feelings buried deep behind a calm exterior. But the loneliness had a way of creeping in during quiet moments, when the wind whistled through the trees, when the stars shone bright and cold in the night sky, or when the sound of a distant coyote broke the silence. He would stare at the horizon, wishing for someone to share the vast beauty of the plains, yet fearing that no one could ever understand the life he had built.
Despite his isolation, John had a deep respect for life.
He cared for the land, the animals, and even the wild creatures that roamed nearby. Hawks circled overhead, deer grazed at the edges of his property, and coyotes prowled at night. He would watch them from a distance, marveling at their independence, their survival instincts. Sometimes he felt a kinship with them, recognizing in their solitude a reflection of his own life. He did not resent them for their freedom. Instead, he admired it, wishing he could somehow break free from the prison of his grief.
Even on the loneliest days, John held on to small pleasures.
the smell of rain on dry soil, the sound of horses neighing in the morning, and the sight of a crimson sunset over the hills brought moments of peace. He would take walks across the ranch, Dusty trotting beside him, and feel a connection to the world around him. The land was alive, and he was a part of it, even if he often felt invisible in the grand expanse. John's neighbors had noticed his solitude over the years. They sometimes offered help or invited him to gatherings, but he politely declined. Pride and grief intertwined, keeping him locked in his routine. He did not want pity, nor did he want to explain the emptiness that had settled in his heart. Yet in secret he longed for company, for someone to break the monotony, to bring life back into the quiet rooms of his house. One rainy afternoon, John stood by the window watching the storm clouds gather. The sky turned gray and heavy, the wind picking up and rattling the old shutters. He sipped his coffee slowly, listening to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. The sound was comforting in its constancy, yet it also reminded him of how alone he was. The rain seemed endless, washing over the plains, and John felt a deep, unspoken yearning for warmth, for connection, for a spark of life beyond the routine that had consumed him.
As night fell, John lit the fireplace and sat back in his chair.
Dusty lay by his feet, and the house was quiet except for the occasional crackle of burning logs. He thought about Mary, about the life they had shared, and about the years that had passed too quickly. Memories flooded in. The laughter, the arguments, the quiet evenings, the songs they had sung together. He allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability, letting the tears come, knowing that no one would see them, that the vast plains around him held only silence and the storm outside. Yet even in his sorrow there was a flicker of hope. The land, the animals, the routines, they were all part of him, reminders that life continued, even in solitude. And as he sat in the glow of the fire, John knew that somehow he would continue. One day at a time. The ranch was his home, his sanctuary, and though it could not replace Mary, it could carry him forward, step by step toward whatever the future might hold. And so, the middle-aged rancher lived on, tending his land, caring for his cattle, and walking his lonely paths. He did not know what awaited him beyond the horizon, but he felt the faint stirrings of a life that might one day be fuller, brighter, and shared with someone who could understand the quiet depths of his heart. For now, he had the land, the storm, the fire, and the memories, and in them he found the strength to go on. The morning had started quietly enough. John Whitman went about his usual chores, checking the cattle, filling the water troughs, and repairing a fence that had sagged under the weight of last week's wind. Dusty followed him closely, his black and white fur damp from the light morning dew. The sky had been clear at sunrise, painting the plains in soft oranges and pinks, but by late morning dark clouds had gathered over the horizon. John noticed the change immediately. The wind had picked up, strong enough to tug at his shirt and ruffle his hair. The clouds moved quickly, forming thick, rolling masses that blocked the sun. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, distant but growing steadily. The weather here was unpredictable, and John had learned long ago to respect it. He paused for a moment, resting on the fence post, looking out at the wide expanse of land. The cattle had become restless, their heads turning toward the wind, ears twitching, eyes wide. Even Dusty sensed the tension in the air, his body stiff, nose raised to sniff the coming storm. John had experienced many storms over the years. Some were brief, leaving the land refreshed and green. Others were fierce, driving rain and hail against the barns and fences, testing the endurance of both the animals and the man who cared for them. He had always faced them alone, relying on his skill and instincts. But today there was something in the air that felt different, a heaviness that pressed down on him, as if the storm itself carried a warning. He went back inside the house, shutting the door firmly against the rising wind. The old wood creaked as the gusts pushed against it, and the windows rattled in their frames. John checked the latches and fastened the shutters, moving with careful, practiced motions. He could hear the first drops of rain striking the roof, soft at first, then heavier, pounding in irregular rhythms. The smell of wet earth filled the house, sharp and familiar. There was a sense of urgency in the storm, as if it were announcing that something was coming, something unexpected. John sat in his chair by the window drinking a cup of coffee, watching the clouds swirl across the sky. Dusty lay at his feet, restless but obedient. The storm was gathering speed, and the wind carried with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. John's mind, always alert to the patterns of life on the ranch, began to notice something unusual. In the distance, through the sheets of rain, he thought he saw movement, shadows crossing the open fields, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. But he frowned, straining his eyes.
The plains were wide and empty most of the time, and it was rare to see anyone traveling across them.
Travelers usually took the road, and it was miles away from his ranch. Yet these shapes moved with purpose, cutting through the tall grass, heading in his direction. John felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. He had spent so many years alone that any unexpected presence unsettled him, especially on a day like this, when the storm made the world feel smaller, confined, and unpredictable. As the rain fell harder, the shapes became harder to see. The sky was a solid sheet of gray, the horizon blurred by heavy drops, and the wind whistled through the trees at the edge of his property. John felt a shiver run down his spine, a mixture of caution and curiosity. He had faced many challenges on the ranch, wild animals, broken fences, harsh winters, but he had never faced anything like this, the unknown approaching his home while the storm raged. He moved to the door, checking the bolt, then opened it just enough to peek outside. The rain lashed against his face, cold and relentless, and the wind tried to push him back inside. Dusty barked, a sharp, protective sound that cut through the roar of the storm. And then John saw her. A woman, soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her, appeared on the path leading to the house. She moved carefully but quickly, leaning into the wind, head down, hands pressed to her chest to shield herself from the driving rain. There was something about her presence alone in the storm, her determination, that made John pause. She was not just a traveler caught in the rain. She seemed to be fleeing, searching, desperate. John felt a surge of instinct, a mixture of concern and caution. He had been alone for 8 years. Visitors were rare, and strangers even rarer. Yet something in the way she moved, the urgency in her steps, made him hesitate before retreating. Slowly, he opened the door wider, letting the storm enter along with the woman. The wind blew through the cracks, chilling the room, and rainwater dripped from her hair onto the floor. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I need shelter. Brace. I have nowhere else to go." Frowned in desperation. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her face, and eyes that seemed both fearful and determined. Her clothes were simple but worn, soaked through from the storm. Something about her reminded him of the stories he had heard growing up, the stories of travelers, of people seeking refuge in the harsh lands of New Mexico. He sensed that she was not just lost, but in danger. Without a word, he gestured for her to come inside. She stepped across the threshold, shaking from cold and exhaustion. John closed the door behind her and latched it, the storm outside now sounding like a roaring river. He fetched a towel from the linen closet and handed it to her, his hands steady despite the nervous energy building in the room. She took it with a grateful nod, wrapping it around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving his. Dusty sniffed her cautiously, then settled at her feet, sensing no threat. The woman sank into a chair near the fire, letting the warmth seep into her chilled body. John sat across from her, studying her silently, and did not ask questions immediately. He had learned long ago that some things revealed themselves in time, and pressing too soon could drive people away. The storm outside created a natural pause, a buffer between the chaos of the world and the quiet safety of the ranch. As the rain hammered the roof and wind rattled the windows, John felt something stir inside him, an emotion he had not experienced in years. It was not joy, nor was it fear. It was curiosity, mixed with concern, and something deeper, a faint, fragile hope. He realized that life, even in its most unpredictable moments, could still surprise him. The storm, the woman, the unexpected knock at his door. It was a disruption, yes, but also a possibility.
Hours passed as the storm continued to rage.
John tended to her, giving her dry clothes, a warm meal, and hot tea. She spoke little, her voice quiet and cautious, but her presence brought an energy to the house that John had not felt in years. Britt. The walls, which had held only silence, now echoed with movement and the soft sound of conversation. The fire crackled, and the room felt warmer, not just from the flames, but from the sense of life returning, breath. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Rain fell in sheets, lightning flashed across the horizon, and the wind howled through the trees. Britt. Inside, however, there was a fragile calm. John watched her as she ate slowly, noticing the careful way she moved, the tension in her shoulders, and the way her eyes occasionally drifted to the window, as if measuring the storm. Bah! She was weary, but not defeated, and something about her resilience touched him. By evening, the storm had reached its peak. John had prepared a small bed in the guest room, using blankets and sheets to make it as comfortable as possible. The woman, hesitant at first, accepted the arrangement with quiet gratitude. She sat by the fire for a few more minutes, staring into the flames, before finally retreating to the room he had prepared. John closed the door behind her, listening to the soft sound of rain against the window. For the first time in many years, he felt a shift in his own solitude. He returned to his chair by the window, dusty at his side, and stared out at the storm-swept plains. Something had changed. The land, the rain, and the woman's presence had stirred something inside him, a feeling he could not yet name. It was anticipation, perhaps, or the faintest whisper of hope. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, a mix of fear, excitement, and the unknown. And as he sat there, watching the lightning illuminate the endless fields, John Whitman realized that his life, quiet and predictable for so long, might be on the verge of something unexpected. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the ranch damp but calm. The sky was still gray, with clouds drifting slowly across the horizon, but the heavy wind and pounding rain were gone. John Whitman woke before sunrise, as he always did, moving quietly around the house so as not to disturb the woman who had spent the night in the guest room. Dusty, his loyal border collie, padded softly beside him, occasionally glancing at the closed door with quiet curiosity. John prepared breakfast in the kitchen, the smell of frying eggs and fresh coffee filling the house. The woman had not emerged yet, and John debated whether to knock on the door or let her rest. After all, she had traveled through the storm, soaked and exhausted. He decided to wait. Knowing patience was better than rushing someone who had already endured so much.
Instead, he tended to the cattle first, checking the water troughs and making sure no fences had been damaged by the previous night's storm.
The ranch needed attention, as always. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger in his house. After some time, the door to the guest room opened slowly. She stepped out, wrapped in a blanket John had provided the night before. Her dark hair, still damp from the rain, hung in loose strands around her face. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp, observing the room and its occupant with careful awareness. John noticed the way she moved. Cautious, but purposeful, like someone who had learned to rely on herself above all else. "Good morning," John said, keeping his voice calm and neutral. He did not want to startle her. "Good morning," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion in her movements. She hesitated at the edge of the kitchen, unsure whether to sit or stand. John gestured towards a chair near the fire. "Sit. Eat something. You need it." She nodded, moving slowly toward the chair, her eyes taking in the room and the small details of the ranch home. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, a strength beneath the vulnerability of her situation. John poured her a cup of coffee and placed a plate of eggs and bread in front of her. She accepted them with gratitude, not saying much, but the faint curve of her lips suggested relief. As she ate, John watched her carefully. He had not asked her name yet. He did not want to push, but he knew that at some point he would have to understand why she had come to his door in the middle of a storm. People rarely traveled alone across the plains, especially during such weather. The thought that she had been fleeing something or someone began to settle in his mind. "Are you hurt?" he asked after a moment, breaking the silence. She shook her head. "No. Just tired. And wet." Her eyes met his for a brief moment, wary but honest. "I am fine now, thanks to you." John nodded, feeling a small, unfamiliar warmth inside him. It had been a long time since anyone had thanked him, and even longer since he had felt a sense of connection with another person. "You can rest as long as you need." "The ranch is safe," he said quietly. She finished eating slowly, and John could see that her energy was returning, though she still seemed cautious.
After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again. I should explain.
My name is Lita. I am Apache. I didn't mean to intrude, but the storm. I had nowhere else to go." Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. John noticed the way she clenched her hands together, as if holding herself steady. "John Whitman!" he replied simply. He extended a hand, and she shook it lightly. There was a pause, a moment of acknowledgement that went beyond words. Operations, brought together by chance and necessity, recognizing the fragile trust that had begun to form. Over the next few hours, John and Lita began to talk more openly. At first, the conversation was cautious, filled with short sentences and measured words. John asked about her journey, but she gave only enough detail to satisfy his curiosity without revealing too much. He could sense that her story was complicated, that she had experienced hardships he could not fully imagine, and yet in her eyes he saw a quiet resilience, a determination that mirrored his own in many ways. As the day went on, John showed her around the ranch, explaining the work that needed to be done. The storm had left debris across the fields and fences had been weakened by the wind. Lita listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, her movements careful but confident. She was not afraid to get her hands dirty, helping him lift a fallen branch or gather scattered feed. John noticed how naturally she adapted to the work, her presence bringing an unexpected energy to the ranch. By mid-afternoon, the sun had begun to peek through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the wet grass. The storm had left the land refreshed, the scent of rain and earth mingling in the air. John and Lita stood near the fence, watching the cattle graze, their silhouettes calm and serene against the backdrop of the recovering plains. It was a peaceful moment, a rare pause in the rhythm of the ranch, and yet there was an unspoken tension beneath it. "You've lived here alone for a long time," Lita said quietly, breaking the silence. John nodded, not looking directly at her.
8 years. he said simply. Since my wife
passed. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet weight to his words. He did not elaborate, and she did not press him. Some stories, she seemed to understand, were not ready to be shared. I know what it feels like to be alone, she said after a moment. To carry something heavy inside and have no one to share it with. Her words were gentle, but they carried a depth of understanding. John glanced at her, surprised by the empathy in her tone. It was rare for someone to see the loneliness he had tried to hide for so many years. As the day wore on, John began to feel a subtle shift in his own heart. He had always been cautious, keeping strangers at a distance, protecting himself from disappointment and pain. Yet Lida's presence felt different. There was no judgment, no expectation, only a quiet acknowledgement of shared human experience. He found himself speaking more freely, telling her small details about the ranch, about the routines that had become his life, about the animals he cared for. She listened, asking questions, and he realized that he had not spoken to anyone in this way for a long time. The afternoon turned into evening, and John prepared a simple dinner. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Lida helped set the table, her movements efficient but careful. They ate together in silence at first, the only sounds the clinking of plates and the occasional crackle from the fire. Then slowly, conversation resumed. Stories of the land, the animals, and small memories from their pasts. The room, which had been filled only with silence and shadows for so long, now held life, warmth, and connection. After dinner, the two of them sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into their tired bodies. John noticed the way Lida's eyes reflected the flames, her gaze thoughtful and distant at times, yet present. But he realized that this meeting, unexpected and unplanned, was already beginning to change him. His life, once rigid and solitary, was opening to the possibility of new connections, of trust, and perhaps of hope. As night fell, John prepared a second blanket for her, noting the subtle signs of fatigue and tension still lingering in her posture. Lida accepted it with a nod of gratitude, curling up by the fire before finally heading to the guest room. John watched her go, feeling a mixture of concern and curiosity.
Who was she really?
Why had she come to him? And, most importantly, what did her presence mean for his carefully ordered, solitary life? He returned to his chair by the window, Dusty at his side, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch at night. The storm was gone, replaced by the soft whispers of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. And yet, the memory of the woman at his door lingered, like a ripple on a calm pond, reminding him that life could still surprise him even after years of isolation. John Whitman, middle-aged and long accustomed to solitude, realized that his life was no longer entirely his own. Someone else had entered it, bringing with her uncertainty, energy, and the faintest stirrings of change. He did not know what the future held, but he felt, for the first time in many years, that he was no longer completely alone. The next morning, John Whitman woke to the soft sound of bird song and the faint smell of wet earth carried in from the rain-soaked fields. Dusty, already awake, nudged him gently, eager for the morning routine. John rose slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, and went about checking on the cattle. The storm had passed, leaving the land refreshed and vibrant. Green shoots of grass peeked through the soil, and the cattle grazed calmly in the early light, their coats gleaming from the rain. Lita emerged from the guest room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked more rested than the day before, though still cautious. John noticed how she moved with quiet confidence, yet there was a lingering tension in her shoulders, a hint that her journey had been difficult and dangerous. "Morning," he said simply, keeping his voice calm. "Morning," she replied, She paused near the doorway, glancing out at the fields and then back at him. The storm. It was stronger than I expected.
I was lucky to reach your door when I did. John nodded, understanding more than she realized. You were.
It could have been worse. The plains can be unforgiving. Brace. He held her gaze for a moment, noticing the gratitude in her eyes mixed with something else. Determination. She was not a person who easily gave up, and he could respect that. After breakfast, John showed her the tasks that needed attention on the ranch. There were fences to repair, barns to inspect, and debris from the storm scattered across the fields. Lita moved alongside him, her hands steady and capable. John observed her carefully, realizing that she was not only resilient but also practical, able to handle challenges without complaint. Her presence, once foreign and unexpected, was starting to feel natural, even helpful. As they worked, they began to talk more freely. Lita shared small pieces of her story, where she had come from, the people she had known, and the hardships she had faced. She spoke carefully, never revealing more than she felt safe sharing, but it was enough for John to sense the strength and intelligence behind her calm exterior. In turn, he told her about the ranch, the routines he followed, and the life he had built over the years. They exchanged stories about the land, the animals, and the small joys and frustrations of rural life. By midday, a subtle tension began to emerge. Lita's presence, though welcomed, also reminded John of how isolated he had been.
8 years of solitude had made him wary, cautious of opening his heart to anyone new.
He noticed himself hesitating before speaking, choosing his words carefully, unsure of how much to reveal. Lita, too, seemed aware of the delicate balance between connection and privacy. She approached conversations with respect, listening more than she spoke, and observing more than she judged. Despite the unspoken tension, there were moments of genuine connection. During lunch, John handed her a plate of bread and cheese, and they sat outside on the porch, enjoying the warm sunlight that had replaced the storm. Dusty lay at their feet, content and calm. For a brief time, the world seemed simple and peaceful, as though nothing beyond the ranch existed. The land stretched out before them, endless and quiet, and the sky above was a soft blue, streaked with white clouds. Breath. Yet even in this calm, there were reminders that life outside the ranch could be challenging. A neighbor had stopped by unexpectedly while they were outside, curious about the stranger at John's door. The man, a farmer from several miles away, raised an eyebrow at Lita and offered a polite but cautious greeting. John felt the subtle tension immediately. Locals were wary of outsiders, especially someone traveling alone through the plains. Lita responded with quiet courtesy, her voice calm and respectful, but John could sense the unspoken questions in the man's eyes. Fras. After the neighbor left, John and Letta returned to their work. The incident had stirred something in John. He realized that having her here would not only change his life but might also draw attention from the outside world. He had protected his solitude carefully, and now it was being challenged, not by choice but by circumstance. He felt a mix of worry and determination, knowing he could not simply send her away, nor could he ignore the reality that life beyond the ranch might judge or interfere. As the afternoon progressed, John noticed Lita's curiosity and intelligence. She asked questions about the land, about the seasons, and about the animals in ways that showed not only interest but understanding. Breaths. She learned quickly, adapting to the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. John found himself impressed, and in some ways relieved. Burton. It was a help, a new energy that complemented his routine. By evening, John had prepared a simple meal, and they ate together in the kitchen. The fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow across the room. Lita spoke softly about her experiences, choosing her words carefully but with honesty. John listened, occasionally offering his own perspective, and the conversation flowed naturally. There was a comfort in the shared silence as well, a quiet understanding that sometimes words were unnecessary. After dinner, John led Lita outside to the porch to watch the sun set over the plains. The sky was painted in deep oranges and pinks, the clouds reflecting the last light of the day. Dusty lay at their feet, and the gentle breeze carried the fresh scent of rain and earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect, simple, and connected. John realized that he had not experienced such a peaceful moment in years, and he felt a subtle shift inside himself. But the day was not without its challenges. As night fell, Lita grew quiet and pensive, her gaze distant. John noticed the tension in her posture, the way she clasped her hands together as if holding back thoughts or emotions. He understood that she carried burdens he could not fully comprehend, that her journey to his door had not been easy, and that trust was something earned, not given lightly. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice breaking the silence. Lita turned to him, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and caution. I am fine," she said quietly, perhaps passing on. Just thinking. Her words were simple, but John sensed the depth behind them. She was weighing her next steps, considering the future, and carefully navigating the delicate balance of trust she had begun to place in him. John nodded, respecting her space. He understood more than most that emotional healing and trust took time, and that rushing either could have consequences. Instead, he offered quiet companionship, allowing her to settle in without pressure. They stood together on the porch for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one, the vast plains stretching endlessly in every direction. The quiet of the night was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a coyote. Over the next several days, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Lita helped John with daily chores, repaired fences, fed the animals, and learned quickly. John, in turn, began to notice subtle changes in himself. He spoke more openly, laughed more often, and allowed himself small moments of joy that he had not experienced in years. Dusty, too, seemed to sense the change, wagging his tail and offering companionship not just to John, but to Lita as well. Yet, the outside world remained a concern. John knew that the presence of a stranger could attract attention, and that locals might question her story, her intentions, or her right to be on his land. Lita was aware of this as well, and she moved carefully, mindful of appearances and cautious in her interactions. Together they navigated these small challenges, building trust and understanding, learning from each other, and adapting to the shared reality of their lives. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lita spoke more openly about her past. She shared fragments of her life, her family, her culture, and the hardships she had faced, enough to allow John to understand her resilience and strength without overburdening him with details. John listened, offering support in the form of quiet presence, practical advice, and shared experience. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to another person, not just in physical proximity, but in heart and mind. By the time the night fully settled, John and Lita had established a fragile but meaningful bond. They had begun to trust each other, to rely on one another for support and companionship. The ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, had transformed into a space of shared life, warmth, and connection. John realized that he had been guarding his heart for so long that he had forgotten the value of trust, of partnership, and of allowing someone new into his world. As he watched Lita settle in for the night, John felt a mixture of relief, hope, and quiet excitement. Life had changed, and though uncertainty remained, he welcomed it. The storm had passed, but it had left behind more than wet fields and broken fences. It had left the possibility of new beginnings, of friendship, of understanding, and perhaps even of love. The days that followed were bright and calm, a sharp contrast to the stormy night when Lita first appeared at John's door. The rain had washed the plains clean, leaving the grass greener, the air fresher, and the sky wider than John had remembered it in years.
Life on the ranch had begun to take on a new rhythm, one that included Lita in ways John had never imagined.
Breaths moved among the cattle and barns with ease, always careful, always observant, yet increasingly confident in her surroundings.
John noticed the subtle ways her presence changed his routines.
Tasks that had once felt lonely now carried a quiet companionship, a shared understanding that made the work lighter. John found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. He told Lita about his late wife, Mary, and about the years of solitude that had followed her death. He spoke of the small joys he had found in the land, the animals, and the routines, but also of the emptiness he had carried in his heart. Patiently, never judging, never rushing him. Her quiet presence, her attentive eyes, and the occasional comforting word reminded John of what he had missed for so long. Someone who truly saw him, someone who cared without expectation. For her part, Lita began to share more of herself as well. She spoke of her family, of her life in the Apache community, and of the struggles that had brought her to the plains. Narration, determination to survive, and the values that guided her life. Each story, each word brought them closer, forging a connection built on honesty, respect, and shared experience. John realized that this connection, unexpected as it was transforming him in ways he had never thought possible. He felt warmth where there had once been only cold, hope where there had once been despair, and a quiet courage to open his heart again. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence together, John paused and looked at Lita. The sun was bright, casting long shadows across the plains, and the air smelled of fresh grass and wild flowers.
"You've made yourself useful," he said with a small smile, handing her a hammer.
"I didn't know how I would manage the ranch this season, but having you here, it's easier." Lita smiled back, a mixture of pride and modesty. "I didn't come here to stay forever," she said softly, "but I am glad I can help." Her words were simple, but they carried depth, hinting at both her independence and the beginning of a bond that neither of them fully understood yet. By it, evenings became their time to reflect and connect. After the day's work, they would sit by the fire, sipping tea and sharing stories. Of desps. Sometimes the conversation was light, filled with laughter over small mishaps on the ranch or memories of childhood adventures. Other times the conversation grew quiet, filled with thoughtful silences that spoke more than words ever could. John began to recognize that this quiet companionship was more valuable than he had imagined. He realized that the simple act of sharing a meal, a conversation, or even the silence of the plains could bring profound comfort and joy. Desperate, yet life on the ranch was not without challenges. One morning a traveling merchant arrived in the area and noticed Lita helping John with the cattle. He raised questions about her presence, curious and cautious, reflecting the skepticism of outsiders who did not understand the bond forming between them. "Bridge," John answered calmly, asserting that Lita had come to him seeking refuge during the storm, and that she had proven herself capable and trustworthy.
The merchant accepted the explanation, though the tension lingered in John's mind.
He understood that life outside the ranch could still bring scrutiny, but he also realized that his sense of trust and community was growing stronger. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between John and Lita deepened. They worked together seamlessly, whether repairing fences, tending to the animals, or preparing meals. Dusty, always attentive, had become a bridge between them, offering affection and companionship to both. John found himself looking forward to each day in a way he had not felt in years. The emptiness that had dominated his life for so long was slowly giving way to hope and connection. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, John and Lita stood on the porch, watching the plains stretch out before them. The sky was calm, the air warm, and the ranch alive with the gentle sounds of nature. John realized that this moment, simple as it was, symbolized the transformation in his life. He no longer felt trapped in the solitude that had defined him for 8 long years. Instead, he felt a sense of renewal, of possibility, of life expanding beyond the confines of routine and grief. "You've changed this place," he said quietly, his voice carrying more meaning than the words alone. It's no longer just my ranch. It feels like it belongs to both of us now. Lita turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and the fading colors of the sunset. And you've changed too, she replied softly.
You've allowed someone else into your life, and that takes courage. Her words were simple, yet John felt their weight. He had feared opening his heart again, had worried that solitude was safer, but he realized now that trust and connection were worth the risk.
As the night settled over the ranch, John and Lita prepared for bed. The fire had burned low, casting a warm glow over the room. Dusty lay at the foot of John's chair, content and calm. John watched Lita move through the room, noticing the quiet strength in her presence, the care she took in her actions, and the sense of peace that now seemed to permeate the house. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for her arrival but for the changes she had inspired in him. In the weeks that followed, life on the ranch settled into a harmonious routine. John and Lita worked together, laughed together, and shared stories of the past and hopes for the future. The land, once a symbol of solitude and routine, had become a space of shared life and renewed purpose. John felt a deep sense of contentment he had not known in years, and he understood that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in his life. One morning as the sun rose over the plains, John found himself standing at the door of the ranch, looking out at the horizon. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and growing grass. Dusty barked happily at a group of cattle grazing nearby, and Lita emerged from the house carrying a basket of supplies for the day. John felt a sense of calm and anticipation, knowing that life, though unpredictable, was rich with possibility. He realized that the storm that had brought Lita to his door months ago had been more than a natural event. It had been a turning point, a catalyst for change. The woman who had appeared at his doorstep seeking shelter and safety had transformed his life. She had brought warmth where there had been cold, companionship where there had been loneliness, and hope where there had been despair. Breath, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly from his shoulders. He understood that life would continue to bring challenges, storms, and moments of uncertainty. But he also knew that he no longer faced those challenges alone. He had learned the value of trust, the strength of resilience, and the quiet power of connection. As Lita approached, smiling and carrying the basket, John felt a sense of peace he had not experienced in years. He knew that their journey together was only beginning, that there would be more challenges to face and more joys to discover. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that he would do so not alone, but with someone who had become an integral part of his life. The plains stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, now echoed with life, laughter, and shared purpose. John and Lita walked together across the fields, Dusty at their side, each step carrying them forward into a future filled with possibility. The storm was behind them, but its impact remained, a reminder that life's unexpected moments could bring the greatest blessings. In the quiet of the morning, with the wind whispering through the grass and the sun rising over the horizon, John Whitman understood a simple truth. Life, even after years of isolation and loss, could surprise, heal, and renew. And sometimes, the arrival of a single person, someone brave, determined, and compassionate, was enough to transform everything.